The first time Eliza Hartwell walked into a London ballroom after 2 years away, no one turned to look at her. That was the precise nature of it. Not a hush, not a ripple of whispered recognition, not even the sidelong cruelty of a deliberate cut. She simply entered Lady Pembridge's spring ball on the arm of her Aunt Cecily, and the room continued its business without interruption. 200 candles burning above the dancers, the musicians bowing through a country dance, the silk and the diamonds and the powdered shoulders, all arranged in their proper configurations as though she had never been among them, and as though her absence had cost the whole of society nothing at all. She had expected this. She had dressed for it with great care, choosing a gown of pale blue muslin that her aunt had pressed into shape the evening before, and pinning her dark hair simply, without the elaborate curls the season seemed to require. It was the armor of inconspicuousness, chosen not out of defeat, but out of a particular kind of discipline she had learned in 2 years of keeping accounts in a Wiltshire farmhouse, while her cousin's household ran on her invisible labor. She knew how to occupy a room without claiming it. She had become rather too good at that. What she had not prepared for was the voice of Lady Eugenia Sharp, standing not 6 feet away behind the floral arrangement near the door, speaking into the ear of Mrs. Northcote in a tone calibrated to carry. "The vanished Miss Hartwell," Lady Eugenia said. "I confess I had quite forgotten she existed." Mrs. Northcote made a small sound of agreement. "One does. 2 years is rather a long time to simply disappear. I had assumed she married quietly. Some country clergyman, perhaps. Or worse." Eliza kept her face still. She had learned that too. She did not yet see the man at the far end of the room who had, at the sound of her name, gone entirely motionless. Edmund Vane, Duke of Ashmore, was standing near the terrace doors when Eliza entered, and the particular quality of his attention was something the room around him had grown accustomed to ignoring. He was 31 years old, broad-shouldered, and possessed of a face that experience had settled into something between severity and grief. He held his glass without drinking from it. His jaw was level, his eyes the color of a winter sky before snow, and he had spent the better part of the last 6 months in a state of controlled withdrawal that his mother referred to, with some precision, as appropriate mourning, and that his steward referred to, privately, as dangerous stillness. When he heard the name Hartwell spoken, he turned his head by a fraction. He saw a young woman in pale blue muslin standing very straight near the door, her aunt's hand on her arm, her own hands folded, and her face wearing an expression of complete composure that cost her something he could not yet have named. He did not move toward her. He did not speak. He simply observed the quality of her stillness for a moment that lasted longer than it had any reason to, then raised his glass and turned back toward the terrace doors. No one watching him would have noticed anything at all. To understand why 2 years had swallowed Eliza Hartwell whole, one must understand the specific machinery that produced her disappearance, because it was not dramatic and it was not singular. It was slow and legal and conducted in the language of family obligation, which made it nearly impossible to contest. Her father, Mr. Richard Hartwell, had died in the spring of 1814, leaving behind a comfortable house in Berkshire, a modest income, and a debt of £4,000 to a Mr. Alvanley Croft, a debt Gerald Hartwell had co-signed without his father's full knowledge and had concealed from Eliza entirely. When the solicitor read the terms, Eliza had been 22 years old, recently presented, and in possession of everything a young woman of her station was supposed to want from the season. Gerald was 30, and panicked, and had in the preceding months developed a solution he seemed to consider elegant. He had arranged, through an intermediary he declined to name, for Eliza's hand to be offered to a Mr. Silas Grantham of Wiltshire, in exchange for Grantham assuming the £4,000 debt outright. Eliza would not have a dowry. She would have, instead, the cancellation of a brother's obligation and the privilege of keeping the family name from public disgrace. She had refused Gerald to his face. She had done so quietly and precisely, naming every element of the arrangement that made it what it was, which was a sale. Gerald had responded by making it clear that her alternatives were to accept, or to watch him declare insolvency in terms that would destroy what remained of their father's name and leave her with nothing at all to return to. She had not accepted. She had also understood that she could not stay. She had written to her cousin, Mrs. Margaret Darby, in Wiltshire, and had gone there with 2 trunks and no explanation, and had spent 26 months managing Margaret's household, educating Margaret's 3 children, keeping the accounts for 2 farms and a kitchen garden, and refusing, with considerable internal effort, to allow the experience to persuade her that she had no future worth protecting. Gerald had not written. He had, apparently, found another arrangement for his debt. She did not know the details and had not sought them. If you find yourself wondering, as Eliza did on that spring evening in Lady Pembridge's ballroom, whether 2 years of invisibility can be survived without cost, the answer is that it can be survived. The cost is simply that the question itself no longer frightens you. Leave a comment below if you have ever had to rebuild something the world decided was finished. Eliza Hartwell knew that particular architecture well. The season of 1816 opened around her in gradations she recognized from memory, but experienced now as a foreign country. She knew the gestures and the forms. She had forgotten the precise weight of them. Her Aunt Cecily, a widow of 60 who had married well and outlasted the grief of it, moved through Lady Pembridge's rooms with the authority of someone who had attended these gatherings long enough to remember when everyone present had been in leading strings, and she introduced Eliza to 3 hostesses and 2 viscountesses and 1 aging admiral before Eliza had quite recovered her bearings. The first time she saw Edmund again that evening, he was across the room from her, speaking with Lord Pembridge in the measured, level way that suggested he was not truly speaking with Lord Pembridge at all, but simply occupying the conversation while his attention was elsewhere. His gaze moved through the room with the methodical patience of a man cataloguing something, and when it reached her, it stopped for the space of 2 full seconds before moving on. She did not note this as significant. She had grown very precise about not assigning significance to things that had innocent explanations. The second time was at the supper table, where she was seated near the middle, between a young barrister named Mr. Thomas Corby, who spoke agreeably about nothing, and an older woman who did not speak at all. Edmund sat at the far end, near Lady Pembridge herself, and he was turned slightly away from Eliza's position when she happened to look up and find that he was not, in fact, turned away at all, but was watching her over the rim of his untouched wine-glass with an expression she could not interpret from this distance. She looked down at her plate. When she looked up again, he was speaking to the hostess. The third time was at the door, near midnight, when Eliza was retrieving her aunt's mantle from a footman, and she heard a voice behind her, low and very level. "Miss Hartwell," he said, "your aunt left her fan near the punch table, 3rd chair on the left." She turned. He was close enough that she could see the precise line of his jaw, the controlled neutrality of his expression, and the small, careful way he had of holding himself as though every movement was deliberate. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said. He inclined his head. He did not offer her any further speech. He turned and moved back into the room, and she stood for a moment with her aunt's mantle over her arm, aware that her heart was behaving in a way that had nothing to do with gratitude. The fan was exactly where he had said it would be. Lady Dorothea Vane, the Dowager Duchess of Ashmore, first addressed the question of Eliza Hartwell at a Tuesday morning call, 3 days after Lady Pembridge's ball in the drawing room of Mrs. Adelaide Norris. In the company of 5 women whose collective social authority was enough to determine the weather of a season with very little effort. "The Hartwell girl has come back," the dowager said, in the same tone she might use to remark that a chair had been placed incorrectly. She held her fan at a measured height and did not look at anyone in particular. "I confess I find it rather bold. After 2 years of complete absence with no explanation offered, one would think simple propriety would counsel a quieter return." Mrs. Norris agreed. Mrs. Fellows agreed. Miss Cecily Hargrove, who sat at the dowager's right hand in a gown of embroidered primrose, and who represented everything the current season had decided to admire, said nothing, but arranged her expression into something that communicated agreement without requiring the endorsement of speech. "She has nothing, of course," the dowager continued. "No fortune, no family to speak of. A brother who is, I understand, in some difficulty. Whatever she imagines she will find in London this season, she will find it difficult to locate." She paused. Poor thing. 2 words, spoken softly, heard by 5 women who would each carry them into at least 4 other conversations before the week was finished. The dowager did not hate Eliza Hartwell. She did not know her well enough for that. She simply knew that her son had gone still in a particular way at Lady Pembridge's ball, in a way she had observed him go still only once before, and that it alarmed her. Eliza herself was not at Mrs. Norris's Tuesday call. She was, at that precise moment, in the servants' hall of her Aunt Cecily's rented house in Henrietta Street, having followed the sound of an argument down 2 flights of stairs, and was now standing in the doorway, while the housekeeper, Mrs. Greer, held a length of lace and spoke in the clipped, righteous tones of someone who has already decided what has happened. The girl in the center of the room was perhaps 17, wearing the plain dress of a housemaid. And she was not crying, which Eliza noted. Crying in that situation would have been the natural response. Not crying required either guilt or the specific dignity of innocence so far past explaining itself that it had given up trying. The lace was Aunt Cecily's, supposedly missing from the upstairs dressing table, and it had been found, Mrs. Greer maintained, in the housemaid's apron pocket. Eliza asked the girl her name. The girl said it was Nan. Eliza asked Nan whether she had taken the lace. Nan said no. And her eyes held the blank steadiness of someone who had been telling the truth for so long in this conversation that she had passed through the stage of expecting to be believed. Eliza looked at Mrs. Greer. She asked when the lace had last been seen in its proper place. Mrs. Greer said yesterday morning. Eliza then asked which housemaids had been responsible for the upstairs rooms on Monday, and Mrs. Greer, who had not expected the question to go in that direction, named 2 girls, of whom Nan was not one. Monday had been Nan's day to clean the hall and the kitchen passage. There was a silence in the servants' hall. Eliza said, with some care, that she thought the lace had most likely traveled on someone's sleeve or apron without anyone's knowledge, which happened with lace, and that Mrs. Greer might like to inspect the other housemaids' things before drawing a conclusion. She said this without raising her voice and without looking at Mrs. Greer in any way that would require the housekeeper to feel she had been accused of an error rather than assisted toward a correct one. She did not know that Edmund was standing in the doorway behind her. She had come to Henrietta Street with a query from his mother, who had sent a card requesting Aunt Cecily's address, and the footman had directed him to the servants' hall without quite meaning to. He had arrived at the doorway in time to hear the entire exchange from Nan's name through the question about Monday's household assignments. He stood, still in his coat, without entering, and watched Eliza address the housekeeper. When she had finished and turned back toward the stairs, she nearly walked directly into him. She stopped. Her composure, which had been entirely present 40 seconds earlier, flickered briefly, and then reconstituted itself. "Your Grace," she said. "I was not aware of your arrival." "No," he said. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not name. "You were not." He offered his card to the footman and said he would return at a more convenient hour. He left before she had recovered the words to respond. He had refused reward, was the thing that stayed with him. She had fixed an injustice in a servants' hall with no witnesses she knew of, and had then turned to walk back upstairs without waiting to be thanked, and it had cost him something to leave the doorway as steadily as he did. Edmund Vane had learned 3 years earlier what it meant to fail to see a person clearly. His wife, Catherine, had been 22 when he married her, 24 when she died, and he had loved her in the particular way available to men who have been trained to understand love as duty. He had provided for her. He had been faithful. He had been correct in every formal observance of the role. And when she had grown first quiet, and then ill, and then gone, he had stood at the foot of her bed and understood, with a completeness that could not be adjusted or revised, that he had seen the form of her rather than the person inside it, and that she had known this, and had loved him anyway, and that this was the thing he could not forgive himself. He had turned her portrait to the wall in the east sitting room, not as a gesture of grief, but as a form of accountability. He had told himself he would turn it back when he was no longer the man who had failed to see her. He did not know, precisely, when he had begun to notice that the quality of attention he had recently failed to give Catherine was now organizing itself around a woman in a plain blue gown who addressed housemaids by name and declined to accept credit for preventing an injustice. He told himself this was not what it was. The dismissive label came for the second time at the Hartley Moore dinner party 3 weeks into the season, in the company of 16 persons, including Eliza herself, though Lady Dorothea directed her words at Mrs. Hartley Moore and not at Eliza's end of the table, and had every technical protection of not having spoken directly. "The difficulty with young women who disappear for a season or two," the dowager said, in the tone of someone making a general observation, "is that they return expecting the world to have held their place. But the world has an excellent memory, and it does not, in my experience, hold places for people who abandon them without explanation." She lifted her wineglass. "Particularly provincial ones." Eliza heard every syllable. The table nearest her continued its conversation without interruption. Gerald, who was seated 4 chairs away and had managed to receive an invitation through a connection Eliza had not been informed of, looked at his fork. Edmund, seated at the center of the table, looked at the dowager. His face did not change. He poured wine for the woman on his left and said nothing. And the absence of his response landed differently in Eliza's ear than agreement would have. She still told herself it meant nothing. The proximity beats accumulated without announcement. He crossed a room to stand beside her at the Viscount Arden's garden party, where it had begun to rain lightly, and said simply, "Come inside," in a tone that was not a suggestion. She came inside. He followed. He did not explain himself further, but brought her a cup of tea and stood beside her near the window, while the garden dripped, and she was aware with acute physical precision of the distance between his shoulder and hers, which was perhaps 8 inches, and felt under the circumstances both entirely proper and entirely insufficient. At the Duchess of Fenmore's musical evening, she lost her program between 2 chairs, and he retrieved it and returned it without comment. And their fingers overlapped on the paper for a moment that lasted precisely as long as it needed to, and no longer. At the Royal Academy's summer exhibition, he found her standing in front of a landscape painting of Wiltshire Downs, and said, "You know that country," without phrasing it as a question. She said, "I do." And then, because the painting was very accurate, and she was not prepared for the way accuracy could produce feeling, she said nothing else for a moment. He stood beside her and looked at the painting, and also said nothing. It was the most honest conversation she had participated in all season. She did not allow herself to construe it. She had learned, in 2 years of isolated labor, not to assign weight to things that might simply be courtesy. Men of his rank were often courteous. Courtesy was the lubricant of the social machinery. It meant nothing structural. She repeated this to herself at some regularity and found it only partially persuasive. The third voicing of the dismissive label came not from the dowager directly, but from Miss Cecily Hargrove. Which made it worse, because Miss Hargrove had the particular cruelty of youth, which is to repeat the words of its elders, without the elders' capacity for regret. It was at Lady Durward's card party, which Eliza had attended because her aunt had pressed her, and because refusing every invitation was its own form of declaration. She had been in the hallway near the card room, not playing, watching the season go about its confident business, when she heard Miss Hargrove's voice carry from the adjoining room, where the door stood 3/4 open. "The vanished Miss Hartwell," Miss Hargrove said, to someone Eliza could not see. "Lady Dorothea says she had no explanation and no prospects, and came back simply because she had nowhere else to go." A pause, the small social glitter of a young woman performing confidence borrowed from a more powerful source. Poor provincial thing. Eliza stood in the hallway. Her hands were folded. Her face was, to anyone who happened to pass, entirely composed. She went home early and said to her aunt that she had a headache, which was not quite a lie. The dark moment arrived with Gerald Hartwell, as she had known, with some portion of her attention, that it eventually would. He appeared at the Ashmore Estate Ball on the 3rd Friday of June. Eliza had not known he would be there. She had known the event existed because Aunt Cecily had received an invitation and had been quietly delighted, and Eliza had dressed for it carefully, choosing a gown of ivory silk that was the most beautiful thing she owned, and that she had purchased with money from her own careful savings over 2 years, which she believed gave her a particular right to wear it without apology. The Ashmore estate on the northern edge of the city was full of light. Approximately 60 persons arranged across 3 rooms, the music from the hired quartet drifting through the corridors in the warm-edged way that music does in large houses in June. She had danced once with Mr. Corby, who was agreeable. She had spoken with 2 matrons who were kind enough, and a young baronet who was not unkind. She had been, in the technical language of the season, present and participating, which was all she had asked of herself. Gerald found her in the alcove near the conservatory door at 10:30. He had clearly prepared himself. He was wearing his good coat, and his expression was arranged in the particular way that meant he had decided to be reasonable, which she had learned to distrust more than his anger. He had the paper in his breast pocket. He produced it with deliberate care, unfolding it and holding it so she could see that it was, in fact, the original debt arrangement, the document that promised her hand to Silas Grantham in exchange for the assumption of £4,000, signed by Gerald and countersigned by Grantham, and dated the spring of 1814. "Grantham has not found a wife," Gerald said. "He is still willing. The debt is still valid, and the arrangement remains binding under the terms as written, which my solicitor has reviewed." He held the paper steadily. "I had hoped you would simply marry sensibly during the season, without requiring this conversation. You have not. You have been in London for 6 weeks, and have attracted no serious attention from anyone, which suggests you understand your own position rather less clearly than I do." She looked at the paper. It was real. She had known it would be real. She had always known Gerald had kept it. "No," she said. "Eliza, His voice carried the patient condescension of someone who believes they are being generous. The arrangement is legal. Grantham is not a poor man. You could do considerably worse. I have done considerably worse, she said. I spent 2 years doing considerably worse because of this document, which you used to make me believe I had no choice. I was wrong to believe you then. I am not going to repeat the error. You have nothing, he said. The reasonableness was wearing through now, the sharper material underneath becoming visible. You have a borrowed house, a season paid for by an elderly aunt, a dress that is very fine and will not be repeated. You are 24 years old, and the season has not found you remarkable. Accept the arrangement. Do it tonight, in writing, and we can have this concluded before anyone needs to be troubled with the details. No, she said again. She was not afraid, precisely. But she was aware of the conservatory door beside her, and the ballroom beyond it, and the particular quality of her own pulse, which was elevated and steady at once, the way it had been on the afternoon she had driven her cousin's gig over a flooded ford in Wiltshire, rather than wait 2 days for the water to drop. She had made it across then. She intended to make it across now. What she did not know was that the alcove had inadequate walls, and that the narrow corridor on its other side, which connected the conservatory to the main passage, had been used 3 minutes earlier as a shortcut by Edmund Vane, who had stopped when he heard his own surname attached to a conversation he had not been invited to, and had remained. He had stood in that corridor and heard Gerald's voice, and then Eliza's, heard the paper described and the debt named, £4,000 and 2 years of disappearance unfolding in plain speech through the inadequate plaster. He had heard her say no, twice, in the particular tone she used when she had finished being uncertain. He had heard Gerald produce the word remarkable as a weapon, and watched his own hands in the darkened corridor become very still. He stepped out into the alcove. Gerald turned. His expression rearranged itself rapidly, attempting courtesy without quite achieving it. "Your Grace," he said. "I beg your pardon. We were simply—" "I heard what you were simply," Edmund said. Eliza had turned to look at him with an expression he now knew how to read, which was the expression she wore when she was recalculating the available territory, and had not yet identified the safe passage through it. "Miss Hartwell," he said. The words were level and deliberate. "Come inside." It was the same instruction he had given in the rain at Viscount Arden's garden party. The same tone. She understood, this time, precisely what it meant. She came inside. Gerald began to speak again. Edmund said, "Stay here, Mr. Hartwell," in a tone that produced compliance without requiring volume, and then followed Eliza into the ballroom. What happened in the Ashmore ballroom in the next 4 minutes was witnessed by approximately 53 of the 60 persons present, and was discussed in drawing rooms, morning calls, and private correspondence for the remainder of the season and into the autumn. It was, in the account of those who saw it most clearly, quite brief. Brevity was, in Edmund's experience, the most efficient container for the things that mattered. He found his mother first. Lady Dorothea was standing with Mrs. Norris and Miss Hargrove near the center of the room, their little arrangement the same as it always was. The fan at the measured height, the diamonds catching the light from the chandelier above. She saw Edmund approaching, and her expression composed itself into the version she used when she was managing, rather than greeting. He stopped in front of her and said, in a carrying voice that required no theatrical effort, simply the ordinary projection of a man accustomed to being heard, "Miss Hartwell is under the protection of this house. If anyone in this room, or in the city, more generally has drawn a different conclusion, I would be grateful for the opportunity to correct it." His mother's fan stilled at its measured height. Miss Hargrove's breath left her body in a small, controlled movement that she covered very quickly. The room did not go entirely silent, because rooms like that one do not go entirely silent. What they do is develop pockets of quiet that spread from person to person, so that within 30 seconds, there were perhaps 40 persons who had registered what had been said and were absorbing its specific weight with the focused attention of people who understood they were witnessing something that would not be repeated. Edmund was not finished. He turned from his mother and crossed to where Eliza was standing near the doorway to the terrace, having withdrawn to the edge of the room with the instinct of someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible. Mrs. Agnes Poole, who had been Eliza's companion during the 2 years in Wiltshire, and who had been quietly reinstated as a guest in the Ashmore household through Aunt Cecily's connections, was standing 3 feet away from her. She was a small woman of 50, with direct eyes and a plain gown, and she had watched the entirety of the preceding scene with an expression of careful attention. Edmund stood before Eliza. The room was watching. "I am aware," he said, "of what the last 2 years have cost you, and I am aware that you have said nothing about it to anyone who might have been in a position to act. I understand why you said nothing." He paused, and something behind his eyes shifted in a way that was not visible to anyone further than 6 feet away, but was entirely visible to her. "I am asking you publicly, here, before these witnesses, to allow me to be in that position now, as your husband. If you will have me. If you will not, I will still address your brother's document before you leave this house tonight. But I am asking." The room had reached the particular stillness that descends when something is said that cannot be unsaid. Eliza looked at him. She was 24 years old, and she had spent 2 years being told, in various registers, that the world had moved past her and had no obligation to look back. She was wearing ivory silk, purchased with her own money, and she had said no to her brother twice in the last 20 minutes, and her heart was conducting itself in a way that she could not describe with any precision except to say that it did not feel like fear. "Yes," she said. "I will have you." Mrs. Poole, standing 3 feet away, said quietly, to no one in particular, "She managed 2 farms and 416 head of sheep and 3 children's education without a word of credit for 2 years. She will manage a dukedom without difficulty." Several persons near enough to hear this turned to look at Mrs. Poole. She met their attention with complete equanimity. Lady Dorothea, across the room, did not speak. Her fan had lowered to her side. She looked at her son and at the young woman beside him, and something crossed her face that was not quite the confidence she had brought into the evening. It was a smaller expression, more honest. Miss Hargrove, to her credit, withdrew with composure, taking her primrose gown to the far side of the room without drama, and was seen shortly after accepting a glass of wine from a footman and beginning a conversation with an elderly viscount that suggested she intended to survive the evening with her dignity largely intact. Gerald Hartwell appeared at the door of the ballroom for a moment. He saw his sister standing beside Edmund Vane in the center of the room, saw the arrangement of the crowd, saw the quality of the attention. He folded the document back into his breast pocket and left. If there were any witnesses to this who required a more formal understanding of what had transpired, Edmund's solicitor provided it in a letter delivered to Gerald the following morning, which explained in precise terms that the debt arrangement of 1814 had been purchased from Mr. Silas Grantham at face value, being £4,000, and was now dissolved. The specifics of this transaction were not discussed in the ballroom, because they did not need to be. Edmund had arranged it 3 days earlier, when he had understood where the evening was likely to go. The season continued for another month. Eliza attended its remaining events on Edmund's arm, which transformed the social weather with an efficiency she found both satisfying and faintly absurd. The same rooms that had received her as the vanished Miss Hartwell received her now as the intended Duchess of Ashmore, and the difference in the air around her was not subtle. She allowed herself to note this with the dry corner of her mind she kept for observations she could not share in company. Aunt Cecily wept with satisfaction at the engagement and said several things about justice and patience that Eliza accepted with affection and without argument. Lady Dorothea called on Eliza the following Tuesday. It was not an easy call, and neither of them pretended otherwise. The Dowager was a woman whose confidence was organized around a social order she had spent 40 years inhabiting and whose disruption she experienced as a physical event. She sat across from Eliza in Aunt Cecily's parlor with her fan folded in her lap, and said after a silence that they both allowed to settle, "I said things that were unkind. I said them because I was afraid of what I saw happening, and I did not understand it. I understand it better now." She paused. "I am not asking for your friendship. I am asking for the opportunity to be useful to you, which is what I am capable of." Eliza looked at her and thought of 2 years in a Wiltshire farmhouse, and the particular skill she had developed for assessing people's capacity for honest labor. "That," she said, "is a beginning." They were married in October, in the church at Ashmore Village, with 40 guests and autumn light coming through the high windows in slanted gold. Mrs. Poole sat in the 3rd row. Aunt Cecily sat in the 2nd. Gerald was not invited and did not appear. And then the story becomes quieter, which is the shape of happiness in most lives. The loudness of the drama resolving into the smaller and more durable music of ordinary days. By the first snowfall of the season, they were established at Ashmore Park, the great house in Northamptonshire that Edmund had been managing with efficient sorrow for the 3 years since Catherine's death. Eliza learned the house the way she had learned Margaret's household in Wiltshire, from the accounts upward, from the kitchen garden outward, from Mrs. Hollis the housekeeper's domain of knowing inward, earning the staff's trust by the simple method of treating it as something that required earning. There was a library at Ashmore Park that ran the length of the east wing, with high windows and shelves reaching to the ceiling and a fireplace large enough to stand in, and Eliza had understood from her first morning in the house that this room was the room she would claim as her own. Edmund had found her there on the 4th morning, at 7 o'clock, before the household had fully stirred, sitting in the chair nearest the fire with a set of estate accounts spread across the desk and a cup of cold tea at her elbow, making annotations in her precise small hand. He had stood in the doorway watching her for a moment, in the particular way she had learned he watched things when he was trying to hold them. She looked up and saw him, and felt the recognition of him in her chest, which was now a familiar sensation, and one she no longer attempted to reclassify. On an evening in December, when the snow had been falling since midday, and the gardens beyond the library windows were quiet and white, Edmund came to the library after dinner and stood near the east wall for a long moment. He reached out and turned the portrait of Catherine to face the room. Eliza, sitting near the fire with a book open in her lap, watched him do this. The portrait was of a young woman with light eyes and a quiet expression, painted in the style of someone who had been trying to capture something in her face and had not been entirely satisfied with the result. Edmund stood before it for a moment, in silence. Then he turned and came to the chair across from Eliza and sat down. "She would have liked you," he said, which was not the same thing as an explanation, but was something better. It was the truth. Eliza looked at him across the fire in the library of Ashmore Park, where the snow was falling outside and the accounts were closed on the desk, and the candles had burned low, and the house was quiet and entirely hers. And she said nothing at all. She did not need to. The portrait faced the room. The fire burned. Edmund's hand was on the arm of the chair beside her, and she placed her own hand over it, and the library held them both in the particular warmth of a space that had been claimed at last by someone who intended to stay. That was enough. It was, in fact, considerably more than enough. It was everything she had refused to stop believing she deserved, through 2 years of Wiltshire cold and £4,000 of someone else's obligation, and every room in London that had continued its business without troubling itself to notice she was gone. The snow fell on. If Eliza's story stayed with you, leave a comment with the moment that felt truest to you. Stories about quiet dignity waiting to be seen seem to find the people who need them most. Stay close.